Magicka is one of those games you play between playing other games. I know that this statement sounds a bit weird, but let me explain. There are different kinds of games if you really think about it. You can divide them in many different categories, and obviously it's going to be different for everyone, but there are serious games you play for their narrative, then there are some you play simply because the gameplay is awesome, and maybe there's another type of game that you might play to compete in, not just because of any story or gameplay necessarily, and then there are casual games you play out of boredom and to relax. And as stated, I could go into even more examples and add lots of other games and categories such as tiny mobile games, browser games, stuff that you would play in a doctor's office while you're waiting for your turn. Ultimately, the point that I'm trying to make is that Magicka is one of those casual games you really just play to relax. The story doesn't matter, you're not here to compete with anyone, but you just want to have some fun and laugh about it. The devs knew this and focused on the humor and the fun aspects more than anything else here. But before I tell you more about all of that, but as is usual on this channel, let's talk ultra-wide support first. Magicka supports both 21:9 and 32:9 natively. The reason why this is important is because the game came out on January 2011. That's right, the game is over 10 years old, yet can do things that some AAA titles can't do today. Mind you, this doesn't mean that it has achieved an incredible feat, but rather serves to show us how lazy many of the developers are today. With that having been said, let's move on to the actual review. Magicka is a game designed to be played in co-op. Up to 4 people can get together and either do the story, fight in PvP, or play some of the DLC missions. The funny thing is that the game has friendly fire on at all times and forces the players into relatively crowded arenas, leading to some serious amounts of mayhem. Since all players are mages, your main focus will be casting spells. However, most of them are left up to the player. You control your character with the mouse and aim with it. The keyboard is used in order to combine different elements into these spells. In some cases, you have to create a different element by combining multiple other ones, such as steam for example, which requires a fusion of water and fire. Add to that the fact that the spells have no cooldowns and there is absolutely no mana system in place here, and you can see how things can quickly become chaotic on the battlefield. I did mention the friendly fire, and it's important to note that a big part of the challenge and fun consists of trying to work together without actually killing each other. This is also the reason why I would say that playing this game alone makes absolutely no sense, since you would miss the whole point of it. The devs even made sure that multiple players can combine their beams into a much more powerful one by crossing them. In addition to that, there are spells which only make sense in co-op, such as the revive spell. Last but not least, the game does not adapt its difficulty to the player count, meaning that you will face the same enemy forces regardless of how many people are playing. The game's difficulty ramps up substantially in the later chapters, and only the most adept mages could even stand a chance of beating it alone. I know I definitely wouldn't. With that being said, the story mode is the first stop for anyone getting into the game. It's 13 chapters long and full of cheesy humor and pop culture references. The story is as tongue-in-cheek as its characters, but it only serves as a vessel which carries the real star, which in this case is the gameplay. Ultimately, the factor which determines how enjoyable the play session will be is your cooperation with other players. Will you work as a well-oiled machine or sabotage each other and revel in the chaos? The game uses elemental magic which applies certain effects. Let's take water for example. You can douse someone and then electrocute them for massive damage boosts, or use wind and fire to create an even stronger blast. What sucks is that these effects can and will be applied to you too as your teammates use them or as the enemy mobs attack you. The problem with that is that some of them can straight out disable the option to use certain types of spells until you have removed these effects. In the case of water for example, so if your character is wet, you have to cast fire on yourself to dry them. Not to mention that if you are wet and someone of the enemies or a friendly even casts an electric spell which manages to hit you, you're gonna be in a world full of pain. That all sounds good when you think about it, at least on paper, but the main issue with these status effects is that they are not indicated in any way other than minimalistic animations on the affected characters. These animations are almost unnoticeable during the heat of combat and have led to a lot of game over screens for us. There should have been some kind of obvious indicator for that, maybe something over the head of the character, maybe a debuff that is flashing somewhere, something more akin to what a an MMO would do. Another thing that I find annoying is the way the characters are tethered to each other. If you want to move ahead or back, everyone has to do it with you. These kinds of mechanics make perfect sense in a couch co-op setting where everyone is looking at the same screen, but they are absolutely pointless in an online session and I don't see why they're here. I could imagine that the developers really wanted you to constantly be close to each other so that you can fall victim to the friendly fire, but if you ask me, this restriction removes tactical options for people who actually would like to work together well. Yes, hitting each other is fun, but I personally find a team that works really well even more exciting. Combining spells, constantly supporting each other by healing, that appeals to me, and I know for a fact that I'm not the only one who thinks that way. Being able to spread out more should at least be an option when making each session. Another issue I have to address is connected to the spell system itself. Since there is no character progression of any kind, the spells never change and you are bound to find the best ones at some point, after which is just a spam fest. The enemies will rarely demand any different tactics for the most part. Very few types of mobs require a more diverse strategy. Even the bosses can mostly just be spammed with the same spell until they die. What I did find interesting is that some of these enemy types will drop weapons which the player can pick up. Each mage carries a weapon and a staff with them. The dropped weapons can have passive and active effects, but some of them are just melee weapons without any effects whatsoever. These are absolutely pointless. Using simple melee is practically useless in most cases, meaning that the game will sometimes drop you a completely useless weapon, which might even be a downgrade from what you're carrying right now. That just seems like a weird and stupid thing to have, since it doesn't really hurt you in any way, it just gives you nothing. You know, if the game, for example, surprised you by dropping a cursed weapon and that weapon debuffed you in some way, that would at least make some sense. Yeah, it'd be annoying for the character, but it would at least teach you, okay, for example, glowing red weapons shouldn't be picked up. That's something. But just dropping you a good old-fashioned axe which you then can swing around to do minimum damage on mobs just seems like nothing. The next problem I have with the game are the many DLCs it has on sale. It's absolutely insane how much one has to buy in order to effectively own the full game, and from what I've heard, the prices have even increased recently. For a game that's over 10 years old, this would not be such a big deal in my eyes if the game didn't have major issues which were never fixed. They just invested time and effort into making outfits and scenarios, but not into fixing Magicka's problems, the worst of which I have not addressed yet, but it's coming. There is one good thing I have to mention though. Only the host needs to have a DLC in order for everyone else to be able to play it, so it is possible to share the expense for the DLCs and play them in this way. With that having been said, it's time to talk about the biggest problems here. First and foremost, let's start with the worst one. The game is prone to crashing at random. Sometimes it will run for 2 hours without issue, then it will suddenly crash for no reason. Anything could trigger it. A cutscene, moving, attacking, dying. It's completely random and sadly has absolutely no cooldown. What I mean by that is that you could crash, start the game, enter the session and immediately crash again. It's really frustrating and happens way too often. Even with the game's generally good checkpoint system, it will still grind your gears when it happens, especially if it happens multiple times, which it sometimes will. If you check the Steam reviews and pay attention to the negative ones, you will notice that pretty much all of them blame the crashes for the negative evaluation, and I can understand them very well. I dealt with it, but it was definitely a huge thorn in my side. Sadly, the game doesn't just crash, it's also buggy. Most of the bugs are just funny things that happen from time to time, but some will get your character stuck for no reason. During the early hours of the game, this means you can't do anything but kill yourself. Luckily, Magicka allows you to cast a spell on yourself, so suicide is not a problem. Any spell can be affecting you just as much as the enemy. You could cast a fireball on your own character. Your partners could revive and heal you after you have died, so then you should be unstuck. Later on, when you get the teleportation spell, it helps a lot with those instances when you are stuck. And yes, I did mention you get a spell later on. While I did say there is no progression, there are about 10 spells which the game will grant you just for progressing to a certain part of the game. I don't think you can actually initiate them before that point, but we never tried. Ultimately, the bugs are quite common and sometimes really mess with the game. We even had a few times when scripts broke and we found ourselves forced to restart the checkpoint and replay it in order to advance. So there's that as well. You can probably tell that Magicka was both enjoyable and frustrating in equal measures, although maybe not really equal ones. When it works and you find the right people, you can have a lot of fun with it. In a game that is well made, the biggest challenge here would be finding the correct teammates. Unfortunately, this is not the case with Magicka. As I progressed through the game with my friends, it became more and more frustrating as the game's ugly side began showing itself. One of the first things to be said in the group was usually something along the lines of, let's see how long we will play before the first crash. If the game was working properly, I'd be recommending it as a party game, but with things as they are, it's obvious that this 10-year-old game is never going to be fixed, and therefore I cannot recommend it. If a developer's priorities are so messed up that they first release a bunch of DLCs instead of fixing their game, they don't deserve your money or your time. I hope you've enjoyed watching my review of Magicka, and while I have your attention, I want to remind you to check out my Patreon page, the link to which you'll find in the description of this video. I regularly post links to free games there, so it's always worth checking it out from time to time. With that having been said, thank you for watching Game Filter, and have a great day. This is Nino signing off.